Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first session on grief. This is our first week of our psychoeducation group as we look more into grief. My name is Tucker Presley. I'm a counseling intern with Joanna Ministries. Been here for about a year now. Here in August will be a year, and I've been doing a group on Fridays for couples, and now I'm doing a group on grief and hope this can be helpful for you because a lot of people, well, just about everybody who lives into adulthood experiences grief at some point, and even some who don't reach adulthood experience grief. Kids and teenagers sometimes experience grief as well. It's a part of the life span for so many people, and so that's why we wanted to do this grief group, because it is such an important topic, an important thing that happens in so many people's lives, and most people have experienced it or will experience grief at some point in their life. And so we want to give you some tools to help you with your grief, or if you know somebody who is struggling with grief, we want to help them. And so we hope that if this is something that you find helpful, that you'll share it with friends, with family members, those who are struggling or just need some information about grief. Hope we can help you out here with this group. Also wanted to say, here at Joanna Snow Ministries, if you need counseling, this is the place to come. We've got a great team here, a lot of clinicians who can help with a variety of presentations like anxiety, depression, trauma, and so much more. Grief, like we're talking about now. We have got some great counselors here. So if you need counseling, or you know somebody who needs counseling, please let us know. We'd love to work with you. So with that being said, let's just go ahead and jump into this presentation today. Hopefully this shows up. There it is. Today, really, in this first session, we just want to do an overview of grief. That's really what we want to do, is just kind of tell you a little bit about grief, different types of grief, and some misconceptions about grief. That's what we're going to be looking at here today. So let's just start off by kind of looking at this idea. What is grief, right? What are we even talking about when we talk about grief? Well, let's look at a couple of definitions. Um, this is from therapistaid.com. They say that grief refers to the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors connected to the loss of something important. The thoughts, feelings, and behaviors connected to the loss of something important. Notice that word loss. That's the word that's going to come up in the other definition. It's the word that really is connected to grief: loss, losing something, the feelings and behaviors and the thoughts that are connected to losing something that's so very important to you. And it doesn't always have to be a person. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But whatever's important to us, if we lose it, we can have grief. We can have negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors connected to that loss. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about grief. Another definition here, and I really like this one from Smith and others on helpguide.org. They say this: grief is a natural response to loss. There's that word, loss, again. It's the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. Often, the pain of loss can feel overwhelming. You may experience all kinds of difficult, unexpected emotions, from shock or anger to disbelief, guilt, and profound sadness. I really liked this definition even more because it gave way to some emotions and to some of the things that actually come up with grief, that are tied to grief. So when you lose something important to you, you're typically going to have negative emotions, negative feelings, negative experiences, things like shock and anger, disbelief, sadness, tied to that loss. That's what grief is. That's what we're looking into. And again, this is so very important because grief, it's a part of the life process, right? We face grief. We lose things throughout life, and we have these intense feelings of sadness and anger and disbelief, and that's grief. And that's what we're talking about here in this group for the next 5 to 6 weeks. That's what we're going to be looking at. So, I also wanted to kind of talk about grief and bereavement. Sometimes these words are used synonymously, grief and bereavement. And in reality, they're actually not the exact same thing. Definitely some overlap, definitely some similarities, but it's not the exact same thing. So I did want to kind of talk about this a little bit to help us understand what grief is a little bit. So if you look at just Merriam-Webster's definitions here. Bereave means to deprive of something, to deprive of something. So if somebody is bereaved, then they've been deprived of something. So it's kind of like the act of something being taken away from somebody, someone being deprived of something. That's what bereave means. Grief is the deep and poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement. You see the word bereavement used there in the definition of grief. So they're not the exact same thing. So grief is kind of the response, the distress of that bereavement, of being deprived by something or of something rather. So bereavement is being deprived of something. Grief is the feelings, the emotions, the things that are the feelings that are tied to being bereaved, to being deprived of something. So again, very similar, and there's definitely some interplay here, but they're not the exact same thing. So that leads to this quote. This is actually from a professional journal here from Zissuk and Shear from 2009. They say this: researchers have suggested that the term bereavement be used to refer to the fact of the loss. The term grief should then be used to describe the emotional, cognitive, functional, and behavioral responses to the death or to the loss. So basically, what we just said there, just in more professional terms, um, researchers say that bereavement refers to the fact of the loss. That it's the facts of what happened, the fact of losing something. Whereas the grief is the thoughts, the emotions, the behaviors tied to being bereaved, to the loss, to being deprived of something. So, again, grief and bereavement very interrelated, but not the exact same things. And I just wanted to um, pull that out because sometimes they're used synonymously. And I will say this: most people who do use these words, interchangeably, they mean no harm. They are using it in the same way just to refer to the same thing, but and technically they're not the exact same thing. But I don't necessarily think it'd be wrong if somebody did use them in that way if they're using it in the right context. But I did want to just kind of um, you know, make sure everybody understood that there are some differences between grief and bereavement. Something very similar too would be mourning. Mourning and grief would, I think, be more closely related than grief and bereavement. Mourning, kind of those, mourning would be, you know, associated with those feelings and the emotions tied to losing something. So those would be very close, grief and mourning. So I think we understand what grief is. It's those emotions, feelings, thoughts, behaviors tied to losing something. That's really what we're talking about here. So, what I'd like to talk about next is some common misconceptions about grief. There are a lot of misconceptions out there about grief. So many, and really, it's kind of sad some of these misconceptions because it's led people into thinking about grief wrongly or handling their grief in ways that really they didn't have to if they didn't hear these misconceptions. So let's talk about some of these misconceptions of grief. Number one is grief only occurs after losing a loved one, or grief is only a response to losing a loved one. Folks, that's just simply not the case. Go back to that definition. I think it was the first definition we looked at, that it's losing something important to you. So certainly a person can be tied to grief. Losing somebody is definitely a way that we can experience grief. is definitely what brings on grief. Losing a family member, losing a spouse, losing a kid, losing a close friend definitely brings upon grief. But that's not the only place where grief comes up, is in losing a person. It could come up with maybe losing a job, right? Many people love their jobs and see their jobs as very, very important, right? If you lose a job, that might really be a time of grief for you. Losing a pet, right? Many people have pets, cats, dogs, many other pets. Losing a pet can bring upon grief, right? That can be a grieving process when you lose a pet, and so there's many other examples of things that you can lose. People unfortunately get into situations where they may lose their homes to different things. Maybe a fire. Maybe you lost some income and you lose your home. That could bring upon grief because you've had so many memories in the house. You've had so much tied to that house, and you have grief. So grief does not only occur after losing a loved one, it can happen in many, many cases. So that's a common misconception. That's the first thing I wanted to talk about. Secondly, everyone grieves the same. This is so wrong. Everyone grieves the same. Um, Folks, and I'm glad more and more scholars and more clinicians and counselors are realizing that people don't grieve the same. And what I mean by this is that how one person handles grieving, how one person handles a loss can be, and I would say should be, different than how someone else handles a loss. There's going to be some overlap and similarities, right? People are going to feel sad when they lose a loved one or lose a job or something like that. But there could be differences in how they feel that sadness. There can be differences in how long they feel that sadness, the intensity of the sadness, so on and so forth. And it's not just with sadness. Like some people may move through the process of grief, which we'll talk about in another session down the line. Some people move through the process of grief quicker than others, right? There's not a one size fits all way to grieve. People are different. Everyone is different, and so everyone's going to have a different grieving process. So here's what you need to know: is that the way you grieve is the way you grieve, and it's okay, right? Everybody handles processing and running, getting through these difficult times differently, and that's okay. There's no right approach to grieving. It's a process. It's a personal process that's your own, and you need to work through it, right? So don't feel pressure to get through it a certain way, or I have to get through it this way because this person did or that person did. No, your process is your process. And so not everybody grieves the same. That the misconception is that everybody does grieve the same, and that's just not true. That's just not true. Number three, ignoring grief helps it go away. Folks, this is a very dangerous misconception about grief. That if I just ignore the emotions, if I just ignore the pain, if I just set it aside or suppress it, it'll just go away. It'll just wash away. And that's simply not true. In fact, I would say the more that you ignore it, the more it becomes a problem, right? Unresolved issues, unresolved sadness, unresolved deep emotions, that's going to continue to be an issue. It's not just going to go away. Um, in fact, it's basically noted by any counselor, therapist, psychologist that facing these feelings head on and addressing them is what's going to help you get through it, right? Ignoring it or putting it to the side and saying, acting like maybe it never happened or anything like that, that's going to actually be more problematic in the long run. So ignoring grief does not help it go away, right? Uh, Really, we want to address these things, and we want to address them in a healthy manner and to get through it. And ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It's still there. You just put it on the back burner, but it's still there. It's still percolating. It's still there in the back of your mind. And so we've got to address these things. And again, doesn't mean that you have to jump right into it and get through it real quickly. No, everybody goes at a different pace, but we need to validate our feelings, and we need to understand that it's okay to be sad, and to get through this process of grief. It's okay. It's okay. So ignoring it will not help it go away. Fourthly, here, grief is linear. And what I mean by this is it's kind of similar to the second point that we talked about. Everyone grieves the same. But I think many times people have this idea that when I start this grieving process, that, well, I'll just get through it in stages and it'll just get better and better from here. And let me just say, folks, sometimes, and I would say most every time, that's not how it happens. There's going to be times where, okay, I'm feeling a little bit better. And then there's going to be other times, oh man, I'm just not feeling good at all. Right? There's going to be ups and downs in this process. It's not just going to be, okay, well, I've lost something and now I'm just going to go up from here and get better and better. No, there's going to be some downs, and there may be some times where you're feeling real good, you're going up, and then you go back down, right? It's not always linear where you're going in one direction. There can be some things that come up, and it's just different, right? It's not just always this process of going in one direction. You're going to experience ups and downs and setbacks, and you're going to experience some good times and bad. Like it's not all just this linear process. It's, to be honest, sometimes it may look like a mess, but again, how you grieve is how you grieve, and it's your process. And it's not always something that is going to be in a straight line where it's all going to be pretty, or it's all going to be great from here or get better from here. You may have some times where it gets worse. You may have some times where it gets better and then it gets worse. And so that's good to understand that it's not always going to go in the right direction. There can be setbacks. And here's the thing, you need to make room for that to happen. Like, to understand, I'm not just going to get better, right? I'm going to have some times where I might have setbacks. You need to give yourself room for that. So grief is not always linear. Fifthly, here, moving on with your life means forgetting about the loss. This is a big one. All of these are big ones, but I think there's this misconception out there that if I move on with this, if I move on with my life, that means that I'm letting go of what happened, or I'm forgetting about my loved one who passed away, or forgetting about the experiences that I had with whatever it may be. And folks, that's not the case. That's simply not the case. You can move on with your life and still carry the memories of whatever it is that you lost, right? And that's where we want to get to, is moving on with your life, being happy again, experiencing joy again, experiencing life again, but still carrying those memories with us, and still having it be important in our lives. Folks, just because you move on does not mean that you forget about the loss, or that you don't care about it anymore. And please don't think that when you move on or you get better, that that's somehow a bad thing. No, it's not. You can carry your experiences with you. Like, again, let's just say, for instance, you've lost a loved one. You can move on with your life, and you can have a happy life, and still carry that person with you, and still feel sad that you lost that person's not here, right? That's possible to do that, to move on with life and be happy, but also carry that person with you, carry those memories with you. And folks, many people say, like, well, it's what they would have wanted me to do, to be happy, to move on, right? It's okay to eventually move on with your life, and to have a happy, successful life, and still remember that person. And that is definitely a possibility, and it should be what we work towards. And we'll talk more about this, integrating that person into our lives as we move on in life. So please don't think that moving on with your life means you forgot about the loss. I think this may be the last one here on the misconceptions about grief, maybe one more, but there's only one type of grief. Yeah, this is the last one. Um, Folks, the truth is that there are actually many different types of grief. There's not just one type of grief. And I guess what I'm trying to say here, and it's sort of similar to what we've said, is um, there are other ways of grieving or experiencing grief than just one single way. And in fact, there are actually uh, counselors and therapists and psychologists have actually identified different types of grief that people may fall under, right? So there's not just one. Okay, if you lose something important to you, where you're just in this type of grief, you're in what everybody's in. There are different types of grief, and that's really what I want to talk about for the rest of the time is the different types of grief that people may experience. So let's kind of look at that here for the rest of our time, the different types of grief. So the first type of grief I'd like to talk about is acute grief. Now, I will say for the next couple slides, we're kind of jumping into what we're going to look at next week or the following week with different processes of grief, how people can proceed through the grieving process. This kind of goes along with that, but I think it's important to show here too. So acute grief is a type of grief. And so this grief is the initial grief response to loss that typically involves a host of negative symptoms and negative experiences. So you lose something important to you, the immediate feelings after that, or the feelings soon, the feelings, thoughts, behaviors really closely to tied to that loss. Like what happened when you lost someone or something important to you, that initial response, that's acute grief, that initial response that you had. So, in particular, in those first hours or days or maybe weeks, I believe this could extend to, people experience very intense emotions, very intense guilt, intense sadness, intense anger, maybe intense regret, and intense frustration. That's the acute grief coming in, right? And typically, um, most people experience this type of acute grief um, right after the loss takes place. So that's acute grief. Um, Another type of grief is integrated grief. Integrated grief. And again, this kind of is following like a process where, acute grief would be like the first uh, grief that we experience, the intense feelings and emotions and thoughts tied to the loss, like right after the loss. Integrated grief would be like the next step, which would be a lasting form of grief in which an individual has come to terms with a new reality and has learned to integrate the loss into their new life. So that's kind of again the next step. That in the acute grief is that initial response to the loss. The integrated grief is some time has passed, and it's this enduring form of grief where you've come to grips with, okay, this happened, and I still feel sad. I still feel, um, maybe feel some guilt or regret. It may not be as intense here, but you understand that the loss has taken place, and you've decided that you can integrate this loss into your life. You can actually still move on in life with carrying that experience with you. That's integrated grief, where the loss is still important and it still has an effect on you, but the emotions may not, and emotions, thoughts, behaviors may not be as intense here, and the shock may have worn off here, and you've kind of come to terms with that loss, and you've integrated that into your life. Like that's a part of you now. That's your part of your experience, and you're carrying it with you. It's kind of what we talked about a few minutes ago, carrying the memories with you, carrying that experience that you went through with you for the rest of your life. So that's integrated grief. And unfortunately, not everybody makes it to this point of integrated grief, and that is a sad reality. And we'll talk about that here in the next the coming slides here. So the next would be complicated grief, and this would be one of those situations where somebody could not move on, and could not, really grasp this new life without the person or a significant thing that they lost. So complicated grief would be prolonged and intense grief in which an individual is unable to adapt to the loss, and they continue to experience intense negative symptoms. So this would be like a prolonged grief response. We're talking about a very long time here of prolonged, intense grief, like intense, like take that acute grief, basically. The initial response where you're having those intense emotions, intense thoughts, and behaviors and feelings there, and that just kind of goes on for a prolonged period of time, a very long time. That's really what complicated grief is. An individual is unable to adapt to this loss, adapt to the reality that something has happened, that they've lost a significant other, that they've lost a child, that they've lost their job, those examples we've talked about. They're unable to come to terms with it, and they continue to experience these intense negative symptoms. And I want to say that I saw that about 10% maybe of people who've lost something important to them get to a place of complicated grief. For some reason, that number is sticking out in my head. I should have had that here. And so I don't want to mislead anybody, but for some reason, that number is sticking out. But go make sure you double check me on that. But thought I saw one source at least that said that. But obviously, this is a really difficult situation to be in, right? That complicated grief where you're not able to adapt, you're not able to overcome the feelings of guilt and regret and anger and sadness. That's a really tough place to be in, the complicated grief. So that's another type of grief, though. Here's another type, is absent grief. And I was, as I was studying for this one really stood out to me. Absent grief is a form of complicated grief. It's a form of that grief that we just talked about, this prolonged, intense grief in which an individual shows little to no signs of distress regarding the loss. So, again, this is a form of complicated grief in which an individual shows little to no signs of distress regarding the loss. So, I'm just talking about that acute, the complicated grief. Complicated grief was somebody's feeling these prolonged, intense feelings. Well, this would be a situation of this prolonged grief, but it's the kind of the opposite. Instead of feeling intensely, instead of showing the sadness and these feelings, there's little to no response of distress. Like there's kind of there's no noticeable response to the loss. And this is a really, really tough situation, again, to be in. And many in this many uh, counselors and specialists, scholars have pointed out that this is probably due to maybe some avoidance here, avoiding the feelings, avoiding the loss, trying to avoid the experience, refusing to accept it. That type of thing may come up here with absent grief, showing little to no signs of distress regarding that loss. And so again, this is a really tough position to be in, but it happens, right? And we need to recognize that this is a type of grief. This is something that people experience, and that is really, really hard. It's really difficult. And here's the thing: I suppose that somebody could probably get to a point where they lose somebody and they don't realize that they're even in this situation, right? That they don't realize that they're not showing these signs, um, and maybe some do, and they realize that they're not showing these signs and symptoms of the distress regarding this loss. But that's absent grief. Oh, it's a form of complicated grief, but kind of the opposite of instead of expressing these intense feelings, there's little to no sign of it. So that's absent grief. Um, the next type of grief, and I'll put this here because it's sort of similar, but I don't. It's really not. Um, from what we just talked about with absent grief, I don't want anyone to get mixed up here. This is different. Disenfranchised or silent grief. Disenfranchised or silent grief. So, disenfranchised or silent grief is grief that occurs when individuals feel they need to hide their grief from others and therefore keep their feelings inside. So this is a type of grief where someone feels like they they shouldn't show this to other people. So I'm just going to keep all the feelings inside. It's not that they don't have the feelings. It's not that they're not sad or hurt, or it's not that they're not angry or guilty. It's just that they're keeping it all inside. They're keeping those feelings of guilt. It's keeping those feelings of sadness and anger pent up inside. Absent grief would really be like the absence of those feelings and those thoughts connected to, uh, or very little of that connected to the loss. Where in disenfranchised or silent grief, someone has that response, but they're just keeping it inside, and so there's no observable sign of it because they're keeping it all inside. And there's a lot of reasons why this could happen. But a good example would be, um, somebody who has a miscarriage, right? Someone who has a miscarriage may not feel like, especially somebody who has one maybe in the early, the I guess the early weeks, where the fetus is very very small, the baby is very very small, and they lose that child, right? They may feel like, well, others may not think that this is all that important, or that this is all that sad. So I'm just going to keep these feelings inside, right? And folks, that's, again, I think that's another misconception right there. Um, if you feel saddened about that loss, well, that's how you feel, right? And it's okay to let that be known. It's okay to show that, to feel that way, and you should be validated for those feelings, because folks, that's hard. Anybody who has a miscarriage, that's hard no matter when it takes place. And that's not the only example. Thinking about losing somebody that you may not know, and I know that may sound weird, but hear me out on this. Like, I think about, when Kobe Bryant died several years ago now. I think it may have been in 2019 or 2020. I think 2020, actually. He passed away in a helicopter crash. A very tragic situation. And there were a lot of, NBA players, Kobe Bryant, NBA basketball legend. Um, and probably a lot of players who didn't really know Kobe, didn't really, never may have never even met Kobe, but may have been really hurt by that. May have been really really distressed by that, and maybe even fans. Fans who had never met Kobe but have only watched him. They may have felt some sadness and some anger and some denial tied to that loss. But they may have said, you know what, people may not think that this is right for me because I didn't know him. So I'm just going to keep this inside, right? I didn't know Kobe personally. And so people might not, think that I should be grieving about this. So I'm just going to keep this inside. That's what we're talking about here: disenfranchised or silent grief. But folks, it's okay, right? If you felt sad by Kobe's passing, or you felt something negative tied to that, that's okay. It's okay to tell others about that. But there are some people who have this disenfranchised or silent grief. But folks, I hope you understand it's okay to grieve, right? And regardless of what other people think about it, I hope you know that it's okay. And we at Joanna Snow Ministries, and I know other counseling agencies too. Hopefully, if somebody is a counselor, I hope that they understand that it's okay to grieve. Regardless of what it's about, it's okay to grieve. And I hope people won't feel like they're a burden or that they shouldn't be able to grieve about something. Folks, if you feel sad, if you feel hurt, it's okay. It's okay to feel that way, and it's okay to let it out and to talk about it. And we'd love to talk with you about it here at Joanna Ministries. And I know there's a lot of other places too that feel that way. So I just wanted to say that little piece there. But that is disenfranchised or silent grief, where someone feels like maybe they shouldn't grieve, or that people wouldn't feel right about them grieving, so they keep it to themselves. So they feel like they need to hide their grief. That's disenfranchised or silent grief. Just a few more here, and then we will wrap it up. um, Anticipatory grief. This was really interesting to me. I had never really heard this term until I was studying for this um, uh, group here. Anticipatory grief is the grief that occurs when expecting a loss. So think of that example right there: a family member who is terminally ill, and you know that they're likely to pass, or you know for sure that they're going to pass, right? You can anticipate that happening. And there are feelings that are tied to, okay, I know that this loss is coming. There are feelings tied to that. There are negative feelings tied to that. So my Meemaw back in 2015 passed away. And really, really sad situation. My Meemaw was just an awesome woman, the best grandmother out there, the best grandmother I could ever ask for. Um, but unfortunately, she passed away from COPD, some lung issues, and it was really sad. But we kind of knew it was coming. We knew that you know the end was near when it was near. When it did happen, we knew it could happen any day. And so we had that anticipatory grief, like those feelings tied to, wow, Meemaw's not going to be here anymore. Meemaw's not going to be there for us to make us those meals anymore, to hug us, to give us those sweet sayings that Meemaw gave us, right? We had those feelings tied to that. That's anticipatory grief. And it's not just tied to losing somebody. It could be something like, okay, retirement's coming, right? And some people know when the time is near, but some people, they want to retire, some don't. And they may have those negative feelings tied to that. That's anticipatory grief. This grief where, man, I know something's coming. It's going to happen. And those negative feelings and thoughts and behaviors tied to that, that's the anticipatory grief. I don't know if this is something people think about, but it is definitely something that is real and that happens. This is anticipatory grief. So when you kind of know, or you're expecting a loss, and those feelings that are tied to that, that's anticipatory grief. So the final one that we'll talk about here is collective grief. Collective grief. So collective grief is the grief experienced by a community or a large group of people in response to a loss or a negative event. So this is like a communal grief. So it's not just one individual. It's something that has impacted an entire community or a large group of people. And there's a collective grief. There's a collective sadness, collective uh, anger or frustration, or these negative feelings tied to this loss. That's collective grief. So some good examples of this, go back to the Kobe Bryant incident, right? Kobe Bryant really was a transcendent athlete, transcendent talent, and so many people over the years have absolutely loved Kobe Bryant. And when he died, there was like a collective grief from the NBA community, the National Basketball Association community, and even beyond. Like, there was a lot of griefs. There was collective grief there. Natural disasters. Unfortunately, we're recording this now, July 9th, 2024, when Hurricane Beryl has torn through several places and really ravaged cities and towns. And from natural disasters, there comes collective grief, where people have lost homes, where unfortunately people have lost loved ones, people have lost businesses, people have lost so many things. That's collective grief. When there's this collective communal sadness, communal anger, and communal frustration, or these other negative feelings that we can go on and on with, that's collective grief, right? So the reason why I wanted to share those different types of grief is to show you again that there's not just one type of grief. People may fall into one or more of these types of grief, right? There could be, um, you know, some people who face a collective grief, right? But they're having a personal response as well, right? There could be somebody who has acute grief, but then moves into another type of grief, moves into complicated grief, or whatever it may be, right? People can move into different types of grief. It's not always just, okay, you're in this grief and that's how it is for the rest of the time. And this kind of goes back to that idea of grief being linear, right? Grief is not linear. That's a misconception that grief is linear. Grief can take different shapes and forms over the process of grieving, and people can get into these different types of grief, and it's not all just one way, and it's this way or no way, right? Grief can be a different process for everybody, and that's really important to understand. So there are different types of grief. Now, let me also say this: this is by no means an exhaustive list of um, the misconceptions of grief or the types of grief. If you go online and just type in common misconceptions of grief, I found several different articles. One had like 16, one had 10. There are different types of grief that you can go and look at online, and I'd encourage you to do that. And also, there are different misconceptions about grief. Like there are a ton of articles out there about the misconceptions of grief. But I just wanted to kind of pull out a few here that I thought were really important to discuss. So, wanted to say I really appreciate you tuning in here, and I hope that if this was challenging for you or helpful for you, I hope you'll share this with somebody, because, folks, again, grief is something that everybody is going to deal with, and grief is something that many people are dealing with right now, and maybe they need to hear something like this. And so I hope you'll share this. So let me just kind of summarize what we talked about. So we talked about what grief is, and grief is the feelings, the behaviors, the attitudes, the emotions tied to the loss of something important to you. It could be the loss of uh, a person, a pet, an object, a job, so many other things. It could take on many different things. Whatever you've lost, you can have grief in response to that loss. So it's those feelings, those emotions, those behaviors tied to, and the thoughts tied to the loss. That's what grief is. And then we looked at some misconceptions about grief. There's a lot of things out there, a lot of prevailing thoughts that are just flat out wrong about grief. And maybe you can go back and watch some of those if you forget about those misconceptions, or just look them up online. You will find some great articles on some myths or misconceptions about grief, and we looked at those. But I want you to understand on that your grieving process is your own grieving process, and how you handle it is going to be different from how somebody else handles it, and that's okay. That is okay. And there's a lot of different things we talked about there with the misconceptions, and then there's different types of grief. There's not just one type of grief that everybody fits in. There are different types, and people can get into different ones at different times, or maybe even at the same time in different types of grief. And so that's what we looked at today. And I hope that this overview of grief was really helpful for you. Where we're going from here is, next we plan to look at like the process of grief. Like if you're in the grieving process, there have been some models of moving through different stages, or some tasks that need to be met in this process. But I do want to say on that too, that it's not all the same for everybody, right? Again, I hope that's clear here, that people may move through it differently than others. So that's what we're going to get into next, is like the process, or the process or tasks of grief and mourning, and how we can get through grieving and mourning. So I really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you for watching this video on grief, and I hope it was helpful for you. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And I hope you have a great